Hi, we continue today in the story of Hannah and Hannah's resistance to the men around her who would have her conform to the status quo, and she refuses. So let's just jump right into our story here. We ended last session with her husband Elkanah's questions to her, probing the reasons for her suffering. And yet, as we saw at the end of last time, the fact that he asked at the end, "Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" implies that he does know the reason. That she's weeping and she's not eating and her heart's sad because she doesn't have children. But as we start our section today in verse 9, she doesn't respond to him at all. She just lets his questions hang there. And we're told, after they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. There are a couple of translation things we need to look into right away to see how the narrator is shaping this, to put Hannah in the most sympathetic position we can, and to put the men in power, both her husband and the priest Eli, in a much less sympathetic position. So we see here from one of our sources that Hannah responds to Peninnah's provocations not by envy or malice like Hera to Sagar in Genesis, but by prayer to Yahweh. And again, if Genesis is written after this, that's an interesting comment on the matriarch Sarah, isn't it? That she responds to Hagar with anger and expulsion, although Hannah's obviously not in the position of power in relation to Peninnah and her husband Elkanah that Sarah was in relation to Hagar and Abraham. So the Hebrew has a different word sequence that emphasizes Hannah's agency. The New Revised Standard makes it sound like they're doing this together and then she rose. But notice the Hebrew word sequence flows like this. So arose Hannah after they had finished eating in Shiloh and drinking. So the emphasis is on Hannah rising. And the image of rising will be contrasted with sitting. Rising and sitting will be contrasted a number of ways. But here, the fact that she rose is a symbol, as rising is many times, of her taking charge of her own liberation. She's not whining to Elkanah. She's not asking for Elkanah's help. She's not saying, "Why haven't you given me children?" Much like Jacob's wives do with Leah and Rachel, who blame him for them not having children. She doesn't blame Elkanah. She goes directly to Yahweh. So she's going to take charge of her own liberation here by having her relationship with Yahweh. Note how similar it is to the midwives at the beginning of the Exodus story, a story that's most famous for Moses and his fight with Pharaoh and the Israelites escaping. That story also starts with the emphasis on women who disobey the men or ignore the men. And Luke will take that up in Luke's Gospel, as Hannah is embodied in split form between Anna and Hannah basically being the same name, and Mary and Elizabeth. But we'll get there in season 4. So Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. And now, in addition to all the issues we looked at in episode 1 that explore how these books of Samuel fit with the texts around them and when they were written, another factor is we have to pay attention not just to the Hebrew, which is abbreviated here by MT for Masoretic text, which is to say the text of the Masoretes in the 12th, 13th century, which is the oldest continuous manuscript of the Hebrew we have. We have older ones in the Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Masoretic text is the one that scholars use for almost all translations. But in addition to the Masoretic text, we have the Septuagint, the Greek translation, conducted in Alexandria in Egypt in Hellenistic era, 3rd, 2nd century BCE or so. And without copyright or even a sense that these were quote-unquote sacred texts in the sense that they should not be touched or changed, the Septuagint translators felt a freedom to add or subtract here and there. So in this case, they add this phrase, presented herself before the Lord. And that thus links Hannah and Samuel later. We'll see in 3:10 that Samuel is presented before the Lord. So the Septuagint translators further highlight the like mother, like son aspect by showing how she presents herself before the Lord here. And notice no Elkanah and no Peninnah here, so she's going off on her own. And then we hear that Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. And each of those details tells us something important here. First of all, we're being introduced to the house of Eli. As I showed last time, we already saw Elkanah and Hannah, and now we have Eli and his 2 sons, and we'll see some more as the story unfolds. So Eli the priest, are we supposed to know what a priest is? She ignores him completely. She's just offering her own prayer to the Lord and doesn't feel any need for priestly intervention. Whether that would have been seen as a radical act or a challenge of the patriarchy depends on when we think this text was written. So Eli the priest was sitting on the seat. Technical term here, Yoseb el Hakasi. Kasi is Polza notes, is first and foremost a royal seat. The throne, the intimate connection between judgeship and kingship is the appropriate ideological zone here. So he's using that as part of his case that this story is a little prologue allegory about the request for sons as parallel to Israel's request for a king, starting in chapter 8. So Kisei is a royal seat, not necessarily a priestly seat. We note here another author, Samura, here indicates that a chair was a sign of high honor in a society where most people sat on the ground. So simply any kind of seat is a sign of honor, but Kisei in particular is a royal seat. And we note it'll come up again not until 2 Samuel when David is on the throne or when there's other moments of royal succession. In the Catholic Church, that becomes the power of the Pope when he is, in Latin, ex cathedra, which is to say, sitting in the seat. So the seat is a position of authority. But Eli's authority is empty here, as we'll see, as well as that of his sons. So he was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple. In other words, in a liminal space, the doorpost being the zone in between the outside and the temple. This is not the temple in Jerusalem, of course, that will be built by Solomon at the end of the very narrative that we're beginning here. The word for temple here is an unusual word, heikal, which usually refers to a royal house. A house of a king, a palace, in other words, more than a temple. Samura again notes that the etymology goes back to the Sumerian word, so an ancient word associated with empires, palaces, and temples. This temple of the Lord contrasts, as we'll see, with other ways of encountering Yahweh throughout the story. And one of the big questions Poles and others are raising here is the narrator at the beginning of this highlighting the replacement of priestly leadership with prophetic leadership. And Samuel will be the bridge figure, the very child that Hannah has prayed for in this very passage. So there she is situated before the Lord, and Eli is sitting on the seat. And she's paying no attention to him. The narrator highlights her struggles, just as we saw that she was so vexed by her co-wife, Peninnah. Now she's described as deeply distressed. Literally, she wailed bitterly in her essence or life. Nafesh is the word there, which is often translated in the Septuagint as pasuke, soul, but the Hebrew Bible doesn't know anything about a soul. Nefesh simply means the essence of one's existence. So she was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord. And this is the first time we're hearing about prayer. The Hebrew word here, to tepelel, can mean to arbitrate, intercede, or judge. So in other words, it's interceding before the person of power, but can also be to intercede before a king or somebody else, as you'll see people request that Samuel pray for them. Of course, interceding with Yahweh. So she is the first person in the story to pray. Eli isn't said to pray, and her son Samuel will be the next one to pray. So you can see the sequence of prayer here. Eli will fail to invoke, note that prayer cannot be invoked there in the situation. But then Samuel will pray on behalf of the people. So she's praying directly to Yahweh, no need for priestly intervention. And the weeping bitterly is a misleading translation a little, because this means bitterly, so literally means wept, yes, wept, in that Hebrew form of intensified doubling of verbs to highlight something that's extreme. So she's really suffering here and pouring it out to God. And she makes this prayer. One commentator notes that we start here in 2:11 all the way through the Samuel story and his commission, one continuous narrative, but of course we're going to take it in chunks. So she made this vow. Literally, she vowed a vow. The verb and the noun are the same here, as you can see here. If you can see the parallel of the shapes of the letters, even if the letters and transliteration in English is different. So she made a vow. So she's the first person to pray, and she's the first person to make a promise to God, whom she again refers to as the Lord of hosts, even though Eli momentarily will refer to Yahweh as the God of Israel. So she's referring to this God of power. If only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me. To look and remember. Literally, you will see, yes, see. The doubling here repeatedly emphasizing the depth of her struggle. So looking on literally the poverty, ba'ani here, the Anawim are understood as the poor of the land and the people whom Yahweh cares about the most. That's from a text in the prophets, and we may or may not be expected to know about that, but we can know that that's what the word means, poverty, not so much misery. So poor in the sense of the absence of children, not the monetary sense that we might associate with poverty. So look and remember. The call to look and remember recalls Exodus 2:24, the response after the women, after the two midwives and Pharaoh's daughter and Moses' sister make a covenant to save baby Moses in the ark in the river Nile. Then the people cry out, and God heard and remembered and looked and took notice. So the seeing and remembering is key to evoking Yahweh's commitment to respond. In this case, to remember me individually, not the covenant, which we're not sure what covenant these people would be expected to know. Do they know the Exodus covenant? Do they know the covenant of circumcision in Genesis 17? We just don't know that. No covenant is appealed to either way. So remember me and not forget. So to remember, not forget. But give to your servant a male child. Literally, it's a man seed. Zerah Anashim here, give your servant a man seed, which is almost to suggest that it's coming directly from God and not from her husband, which really sets her up to be parallel with Mary, although the text certainly isn't suggesting that there's some kind of virgin birth going on here. So if she gets that child, then we have a very controversial phrase. Controversial because it's not clear where the translators are getting this from, because the Septuagint and the Hebrew differ so much. So this whole phrase here is from the Septuagint, other than no razor shall touch his head. But Nazarite, understood as someone who makes a vow not to have their hair cut, is not in the Hebrew or the Greek. It's only inferred from the being given in the Hebrew, give him to Yahweh for all the days of his life, not the day of his death, but the days of his life, emphasizing life, not death, and the no razor implying Nazarite, but it's not ever said there. He shall drink neither wine nor intoxicants. This is added by the Septuagint to be parallel to Hannah's response to Eli, that she has drunk neither wine nor intoxicants, strong drink. Same phrase here exactly. So it's the second time we're seeing the Septuagint authors making this parallel so that Samuel and Hannah are identical, like mother, like son. So, and no razor shall touch his head. So why that vow? Why those specifics? Why she thinks Yahweh would not want his hair cut? We can recall, if we've read Judges, Samson is an example of someone who didn't have his hair cut. And of course, the child she wants, she's vowing to give away the moment she gets it. So it's not even that she wants to be a mother as much as it is just to simply give birth and to not be shamed for being a quote-unquote barren woman. So she's continuing to pray here, and as Polzin notes, the conjunction of the themes of misunderstanding and drunkenness goes to the heart of the matter about kingship. Hannah is speaking in her heart, whereas Eli looks on the outward appearance. On the one hand, Hannah appears drunk but is not. Kingship appears ungodly but is not, at least according to this author, not Polzin, the author of our story. On the other hand, this encounter's backward glance at the book of Judges casts a suspicious shadow on the sobriety of Hannah's request. Was it a wise thing to have asked for? And that's a question that will haunt the story all the way through. So as she's continued praying, and the phrase literally has multiplied her praying, and Sumora, who really highlights linguistic details, notes from a technical book here that this Vahaya here for continued is a technical term noting significant background or important events to follow, and it certainly is an important event to follow because it'll imply the birth of Samuel. So she's praying before Yahweh, literally in Yahweh's face, not Enopian from the Greek, but Lafne Yahweh, so in Yahweh's face, as a very intimate situation. And Eli observed her mouth. So what we're seeing here, as the narrator tells us in verse 13, that she's praying silently, only her lips moved, which is a very unusual situation, because most prayer in that time would have been official. Priests would have done it on behalf of people and would have said it out loud for everyone to hear. The idea of silent prayer that we take so for granted nowadays was a very unusual thing biblically, and there's very few people, and so rare that Eli can't even imagine that's what she's doing. Literally what she's doing here is speaking in her heart. Again, the emphasis on heart here, that she's sad in her heart and she's speaking in her heart. And her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli jumped to the exact wrong conclusion that she was drunk. And it highlights the incompetence of the priesthood here. His sons will be corrupt, as we'll see soon enough. And rather than ask her or observe more closely, he's not looking closely in her face. He's at some distance at the doorpost, as we saw, and making the bad assumption about her. As so often men make bad assumptions about women in the Bible, and as many men interpretations make bad assumptions about women in the Bible, that the text goes to trouble to not reinforce, as we'll see in various contexts, especially around Mary Magdalene in the New Testament. So, moving on here, this, as Robert Alter says, the central enunciation motif of this type scene is purposely distorted. The type scene meaning a stylized scene of how a prophet or an important person's birth comes to be. And so it's sort of a parody of Eli the priest, who would be the representative of God, making a fool out of himself, and showing, as another commentator says, the Eli priestly family is unfit to lead Israel. So the question of the judges ended with, of what kind of leadership should Israel have, and now rejects the idea of long-term priestly leadership. So he asks her this question: how long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Literally, until when will you become drunk? And one might ask, why does he even care? Why is he even interrupting her? What's it of his business? Is it his job to police the sanctuary, whatever the space is described as a temple of Yahweh, to find miscreants, women who are not bothering anybody but appear to be speaking to themselves, but not loud enough that anybody can hear? So in other words, he's being very intrusive in a way that not only is wrong on the facts, but utterly disrespectful of her. And the idea of her making a drunken spectacle of herself is clearly an insult. And then he commands her to put away your wine, as if he has authority over her. And so finally she speaks. And it's, she'd only been heard by Yahweh, and now her first word out loud is no. And as David Jobling notes, the very first word she speaks out loud is to the chief priest of Israel, and it is no. Many parallels to similar sorts of things in Luke's gospel and other places. For example, when Mary goes to visit Elizabeth in Zechariah's house, but ignores Zechariah and only talks to Elizabeth. Luke, again, using this story as a deep parallel for his own construction of the infancy stories of Jesus. So Hannah answered, "No, my Lord," and she calls him Adonai, the word for Lord, but there's a certain irony here, since she doesn't do what he says, and he's wrong anyway. So she describes herself as a woman hard-spirited or struggling in spirit, and there's a great irony here that several commentators note here, including this one here, that she has not been pouring in spirits, but pouring out her spirit. So a joke there that the authors would have got. Not her soul, again, nephesh here. The Septuagint has pasuke, but that's very misleading. So she's saying right to his face, "No, I'm not drunk. This is what I've been doing." And then she pleads with him, "Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman." There's a lot going on here we need to pay attention to. The NRSV again shifts the Hebrew around, which would literally be, "Do not give your slave to the face of a daughter of Belial." And so the question is, what does that mean? That's what's being translated here. Worthless woman is Belial, which is another name sometimes for an evil one, or the devil, or Satan. And it's a real question of how to translate that here. Samora offers a couple of options, whether it's from these two words meaning without worth, or from this word meaning to confuse or swallow or to destroy. And his conclusion is that this idea of the daughter of Belial, which is lost completely in translation, refers to the queen of the underworld in the Mesopotamian tradition. In other words, it becomes a figure of speech for turning someone over to the daughter of the underworld, that is, to destroy them utterly. So her figure of speech here, translated into a different figure of speech as a worthless woman, is to suggest that she's saying to Eli that she should not be destroyed by him, but simply that she's speaking again out of her great pain. Notice how the text continues to pile up words to describe her pain. She was troubled, she's anxious, or literally her complaint and her anger, maybe not quite anxiety, but her complaint and vexation. So Eli is not said to speak to God directly, but he does answer here. And as Brueggemann notes, the scene enacts intense covenantal faith in which the attentiveness of Yahweh is mediated by the priest, but only in function, not in spirit. Eli is clearly shown as incompetent, but simply through his function, he's invoking the response that she's looking for, that God would grant what she asks. But we still need to look a little more closely at this before we're quite done. So he says, go in peace. That's the first time we're hearing go in peace. Shalom in 1 Samuel is a number of times here, and we'll see that it has a number of connotations. And he refers to the God of Israel, in contrast with her Yahweh Sabaoth, the God of armies, or the God of hosts. As Samora suggests, it seems to emphasize the personal, intimate relationship of Hannah, and that should be Elkanah there, and with Yahweh, in contrast with Eli's formal association with the cult of Yahweh. I'm not sure that we can attribute Yahweh Sabaoth to Elkanah, but it's certainly true about Hannah. And God of Israel, what would that mean here? What is Israel at this point? It's the first of 249 times that Israel is used. Israel is used throughout the Deuteronomistic history to refer to the people. So, for example, if we were to search for it here in the entire Deuteronomic history, from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings, we'd see 852 times here that Israel comes up, starting in the very first verse. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan. So plainly referring to the people, not the land. The land was referred to as Canaan at that time. So this is the God of the people who are the sons of Jacob. Do we know them as the sons of Jacob here? It depends on whether we know the book of Genesis. But certainly Eli is simply referring to the God of Israel. And we'll see how Israel, Judah, Benjamin, and other geographic areas and names of the people will be in controversy throughout this story. So the God of Israel, grant the petition, which sets up a great pun throughout, because the verb here is Shaul, which means Saul, not Samuel. So we'll see how that plays out a number of times in this wordplay here. In other words, to ask or to grant is Shaul. And so she responds here, let your servant, speaking of herself in the third person, find favor, a phrase used regularly throughout the Bible, 27 times from Genesis 6:8, from Noah all the way through 1 Kings, in your sight. And one might wonder, why does she care about Eli's sight? Isn't she trying to find favor in Yahweh's sight? Or is she just being polite and respectful here? It's not 100% clear. Literally, the phrase in your sight is in your eyes, a theme that runs throughout. Eli will be described as blind imminently, and what people see and don't see is going to be a huge clue to many motivations and purposes beyond the surface. So although Eli was looking, he couldn't hear, and the moment he'll be blind to indicate that he is not perceiving much of anything. So it ends with, it says she went to her quarters, but that's only implied by the fact they rose the next day. Literally, she went on her way. Derek being a common biblical term for not just like a road or a physical path you walk on, but a way of life, a direction one is taking. So quarters implies simply going to a room, but she went on her way. She ate and drank with her husband, reversing her refusal to eat and drink, and her countenance, her face, was sad no longer. So we see here that Hannah has reached at least a satisfying conclusion that she believes that her prayer will be answered, and of course it will be in the next scene we're going to look at. Meanwhile, the priesthood has been marginalized in the fatherly generation of Eli, and very soon will be marginalized in the childhood generation, and we'll have to see whether her son Samuel has what Yahweh and the people need to be the leader of a people who are in great need of leadership. All right, see you next time. Bye-bye.